All right, y'all, welcome back. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and our next guest on the show today is Nikolas Kozloff. His website is nikolaskozloff.com. Believe it or not, it's spelled exactly like it sounds. N-I-K, no C in Nikolas. Nikolas Kozloff. And he's got this piece at Al Jazeera, aljazeera.com. Oh, wow. I guess they got that URL from those imposters after all these years. What's behind Obama's new military base in Chile? Uh-oh. Welcome to the show. How's it going?
Thank you for having me.
Well, you're welcome. I'm very happy to have you here. Tell me, what is behind Obama's new military base in Chile?
Well, ostensibly, it's to coordinate to help facilitate peacekeeping operations. And Chile in recent years has been deploying peacekeeping troops to Haiti. And so I think the U.S. Pentagon has had to downsize significantly and is looking for collaboration from other countries. So officially, that's the reason for the new base in Concon, in the coastal city of Concon in Chile. However, I think given the history of U.S. involvement in the Southern Cone, in Chile and Argentina in the 1970s and 1980s, this raises some eyebrows. And so I think activists are certainly justified in feeling somewhat suspicious about whether the U.S. has ulterior agenda in this case.
Mm-hmm. All right, now what kind of base are we talking about here exactly? And by the way, I should say for the audience, you really got to read this thing because it goes all in depth about the consequences for the people on the ground there and in other places too. You give the background. So go ahead. You have free reign here today.
Sure. Yeah, physically the base is meant to simulate urban warfare. So perhaps this is meant to prepare Chilean troops that are going to be deployed to Haiti, for example. That's a charitable view. There's another possible ulterior agenda, which is that this base is being constructed at a time of acute political and social tensions in Chile, and so I think that raises eyebrows. And I think if you read the secret cables released by the whistleblowing outfit WikiLeaks, they suggest that there's been significant military and security collaboration between the United States and Chile in recent years. And that's a little disappointing in my view, because I would have thought that we'd turn the page on that military cooperation, and it harks back to the dark days of the U.S.-backed Augusto Pinochet military dictatorship in the 1970s with horrific human rights abuses. And so I think that this base is being installed at this time where you have restive students and this low-level intensity warfare against Chile's largest indigenous group, the Mapuche Indians. And so I think a lot of people are wondering, well, what is this? Could there be some other agenda at foot here?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not like they even have the myth of the Soviet juggernaut taking over all of South America and coming up through Texas like Red Dawn and taking us all over, whatever anymore. The Soviet Empire is dead and gone a long, long time ago. Who's left? The Penguins? I mean, what in the hell is there to fight down there? Other than, I guess you said, their own people?
Well, that's a good point. And I think...
I mean, who's even lobbying for this thing? Is it just the Pentagon is looking for work, or you got the body armor industry lobbyists saying, hey, let's arm up some more cops. Let's find countries where we can arm up cops, or what is this?
Well, I think it's not entirely clear, and this is also happening in the context of yet another U.S. base that was recently constructed just across the border in Argentina. It's the first U.S. base ever in Argentina, in the Chaco region in the north of the country, which is a strategic location which is close to Bolivia and Paraguay. And so you have now two bases in the U.S. Southern Cone, and I think, for me, this is almost like Back to the Future, because you had very tight security collaboration during, for example, the Nixon years and the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile and Operation Condor and all of the collaboration to hunt down leftist radicals in that region of South America. But yeah, I think the question is, well, what is behind this? I mean, in the case of Argentina, the Pentagon says, well, this is for humanitarian relief, and but some legislators in Argentina have been saying, look, this is a Yankee base, and there have been protests against it. And so this whole story of the Southern Cone has really fallen under the radar of the mainstream media. I think one other long-term possibility, and I don't think this is necessarily the case now, but say in 10 or 20 years, perhaps the United States might see Brazil as a rival in the region. So it possibly could be a hedge against Brazil to have Argentina and Chile within the U.S. Sphere of influence in case Brazil gets too powerful. I think for the time being, Brazil is kind of a reluctant ally of the U.S., even though there's underlying tensions. But in the future, it might be convenient for the U.S. to have these bases in the Southern Cone just across the border from Brazil.
There, see, now you're thinking like an imperialist. That's good. I have to assume that you're right about that.
It's not altogether misplaced because the U.S.
I mean, it's not like they're trying to prevent Americans from using cocaine or something.
Well, the political elites and the U.S. right have been a little concerned about the rise of Brazil. So, and you did have the head of the Stratfor Corporation, George Friedman, in his own secret correspondence saying that we need to keep tabs on Brazil. So I don't think it's a concern right now, but I think in other diplomatic correspondence, the U.S. diplomats openly say we are in a competition with Brazil for regional influence in South America. So I think maybe in 10 or 20 years, this could be convenient for the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm. Well, and, don't forget how mad they got at Brazil for doing exactly what Barack Obama asked them to do, which was make a nuclear deal with Iran for them.
Yeah, and I think that right now, I think the United States or the Pentagon needs Brazil because we're doing this pivot to Asia. And so Obama just called for redeploying military forces to the Pacific. So in the interim and in this period of downsizing, I think the United States needs Brazil. And Panetta was recently in Brazil, and he spoke in Rio, and he talked about how he wanted Brazil to help monitor, patrol the seas, and do joint military exercises in Africa, which may be a reflection of the fact the U.S. is stretched a bit thin, and it's deployed in the Pacific, so it may need Brazil and some of these other countries to step up to the plate and help the United States in other areas where we're stretched a bit thin. Mm-hmm. So I think in the short term, Brazil is not a challenge or necessarily a threat, but I think in the long term, perhaps, like I said, having these bases in other areas like the Southern Cone could be a check if Brazil is going to make a bid for larger regional ambitions.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us real quick about this guy, Minister Goni, and the School of the Americas, and then we can pick it back up on the other side of the break as well, if you want.
Sure. Well, I think that, like I said, the construction of this base in Chile is occurring in a time of acute political and social tensions, and so there's been this, like I said, this low-level intensity warfare against indigenous people in Chile, and the upper echelons of the Chilean military are trying to revive this U.S. military collaboration, which you would have thought would have gone out of style at the end of the Pinochet years, but seems to be rearing its ugly head once again. And so the Minister of...
I'm sorry, we got to hold it right there. It's my fault. Bad setup there. Hard break built in. Nikolas Kozloff, he's got this great piece at Al Jazeera, what's behind Obama's new military base in Chile, and we'll be right back after this. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Nikolas Kozloff. He's got this great piece at Al Jazeera called What's Behind Obama's New Military Base in Chile. And I'm sorry I asked you too big of a question right before the break there. It's sloppy of me, but anyway, that's the way it goes. We're talking about this guy Goni, who's what politician or general. The School of the Americas, notorious torture school in the days of the Cold War, especially like in the Reagan years, right? This is where anybody who was a right-wing torture colonel in Latin America was a graduate of this American school, how to torture people to death, kind of thing. Get a master's degree in that. And so now it's called the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. That's very nice to hear. But is that still what they teach, is how to torture people to death? Or is it more just broader lessons in how to be a reliable quisling? Or what's the deal?
Well, I think whatever the cosmetic changes in, they renamed the school, but, whatever the changes, the school just should be shut down in light of the horrific history. So it's really eye-opening to read about in the WikiLeaks cables how the Chileans want to continue to send their military to study at the formerly known School of the Americas. And so, and in one cable, the head of the armed forces, Jose Goni, says that unfortunately there are some opponents of the school in Chile, but we should educate them and organize some junkets so the Chileans can come up and see the school and so to launch a kind of public relations war. And in other cables, the same minister is fraternizing with the Americans and talking about the need to combat Hugo Chavez and monitor Venezuelan influence in Bolivia and Brazil. And so this base that's been constructed in Chile now is happening in that context of there's still the Chilean military, this vestige of the earlier Pinochet years. And so despite the fact that there have been some leftist governments in Chile, not currently, but in recent years, I think you still have this vestige of the earlier mentality in Chile. And then the other thread of this discussion has to do with this really nasty conflict between the indigenous people and the Chilean state. And in other cables, the FBI is mentioned as collaborating with the Chilean Ministry of Interior to monitor the Mapuche Indians in Chile, which is very ironic given that the FBI has a notorious record as far as indigenous people in the United States, if Leonard Peltier is any indication. And so now the FBI is apparently collaborating with the Ministry of Interior in Chile in this low-level conflict against the Mapuche, which has to do with their own natural resources and the Chilean state's desire to export those raw materials in line with its own free trade economic model. And unfortunately, the Mapuche, who are the largest indigenous group in Chile, they live on top of a lot of these resources, such as the logging and the salmon and whatnot. And so in the cables, the FBI is mentioned as collaborating with the Ministry of Interior to monitor these indigenous people. So all of this is the context for this new base, which I find a bit disturbing.
Yeah, boy, you gotta love Bradley Manning and Julian Assange for bringing us those WikiLeaks. People try to play down, it was a little bit embarrassing for Hillary Clinton, the little credit card scandal and this and that. There's so many stories about who is whose sock puppet. And Bradley Manning even said, the stuff in here about how the first world exploits the third, it's just not right. I gotta get this stuff out into the public so that there can be reforms. I mean, this is exactly the kind of thing he was talking about, if it's not the specific thing he was referring to here.
Yeah, absolutely. And also you have the Assange extradition now making the news. And so, but I personally think that all of that is certainly important. I think Bradley Manning and Julian Assange and all these larger-than-life characters in the WikiLeaks scandal deserve the media spotlight. My only concern is that the actual cables that illuminate U.S. foreign policy, sometimes they just don't get the same media scrutiny that Julian Assange gets. And so I think for a long time now I've been looking at what these documents say about the U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. And I think it's very interesting because on the one hand, you have this public rhetoric amongst these left-leaning regimes in Latin America that we're all against the imperialists, but then you see what goes on behind the curtains and how the United States is dividing a lot of these different countries, and Argentina and some of these countries that ostensibly belong to this leftist pink tide in the region say something very different in private to the Americans. They have concerns about Brazil, for example, and the rising power of Brazil, and they say things like, well, "Don't pay any attention to our embrace of Hugo Chavez." So it's one thing to pay attention to what they're doing publicly, but in private, they're still trying to get into the good graces of the United States.
Right. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that. I saw here on your bio page, it's NikolasKozloff.com. You're the author of Hugo Chavez, Oil, Politics, and the Challenge to the U.S. And now I remember Greg Palast talking about how Hugo Chavez had taken $20 billion out of the New York Fed and turned around and loaned it at low interest to the other countries of South America in a way that wasn't, IMF exploitation. It was just, hey, you need a loan, I'll give you a loan, and kind of did fair business with them and cut the IMF and all of them out, plus took all this money out of the Fed, and that had really made a lot of people angry. But then again, that was 10 years ago or more, and of course, I guess they have to deal with him, and he has to deal with the United States, right? Doesn't Shell Oil and doesn't Houston, Texas thrive on Venezuelan oil all day? I mean, these guys have a very solid relationship, really, don't they? I don't know. What is the evolution of that? Is that it?
Well, yeah, that's the irony in Venezuela, because even as Hugo Chavez rails against the U.S. and certainly the Bush administration, it's been a little more muted under Obama, but the irony is that without the money from the United States that pays for Venezuelan oil, Hugo Chavez wouldn't have been able to carry out his Bolivarian revolution and all of his social programs. So that's certainly one ironic twist on developments in Venezuela, although there are certainly a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know the ins and outs of which oil companies have, more or less influence in Washington, D.C., or, whether it's the guys who are allies with or have, solid relationships with him who really have the sway, or whether it's their competition or what. I don't know if anybody knows those deep politics right now. I'd like to know where to read that.
Well, it remains to be seen. I think just as in previous elections, this upcoming election in September, I'm sure the United States is once again dispersing money in many ways to the Venezuelan opposition. So I think what the WikiLeaks tables show is that in the short term, I think the United States is interested in overturning this populist left in Latin America, which includes Venezuela and his protege in Ecuador, Rafael Correa, Bolivia, and, in Honduras, they were, that's a whole other story. I mean, Manuel Zelaya was also a Chavez protege, and things didn't really go Venezuela's way in that case. But still, I think Washington is concerned about this populist left bloc. But I would add that I think in the long term what this misses is that Brazil is going to be the main challenge for regional dominance, and I think you see this in the cables, that diplomats are already aware of the fact that in Peru, for example, the United States is in a direct confrontation with Brazil for a regional influence. And the current president of Brazil of Peru, hired a Brazilian team for his presidential campaign. And there's a lot of Brazilian economic interest in Peru. And so in one cable, the United States ambassador in Peru writes, "We are in a direct competition with Brazil in Peru." So I think, Venezuela had a certain impact on the local neighborhood in South America. It had disproportionate influence because of its oil, but Venezuela is a middle-sized country. It's about 27 million people. But in the long term, you have Brazil, probably 10 times that amount of people. economic output of all the other South American countries combined. And I think that the U.S. political elites are looking somewhat, have some concerns about that. And so I think that's maybe what to look for in the long term.
Mm. Well, I hope your next book is...
Perhaps that is an interesting lens through which to view these military bases in the southern cone, in the Chaco, a region of Argentina, the first ever U.S. base in Argentina, and now in Chile.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope your next book is what all the WikiLeaks say about America's policy in Latin America, because there's so much, there's so many different countries and whatever, but it's got to be summed up somewhere where people can get their head around it, like me, for example.
I've written really extensively about that, probably dozens of pieces. If the listeners want, they can log on to my website, and under the heading WikiLeaks, you'll see all of the pieces that I've done since late 2010, which talk about the rise of Brazil. They talk about the U.S. Embassy in Caracas and what the low-level, diplomatic intrigue that's been going on in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in Central America. So I've written very extensively about that.
Yeah. I see 51 posts under the tag WikiLeaks at your site. Again, everybody, it's NikolasKozloff.com. I ought to bookmark that thing or something. All right, hey, thanks so much for your time and for this great article and all of this. It's I really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right, everybody, that's Nikolas Kozloff. His website, again, is NikolasKozloff.com. And, you can check out all of his books and articles and everything else there. Check out the latest at AlJazeera.com. What's behind Obama's new military base in Chile?